Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Light Shop. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with the bell ringing, signaling the start of evening study. Reluctantly, the students shuffled back to their seats to answer the teacher's roll call. Despite being called voluntary, evening study was effectively mandatory, sparking complaints from everyone. However, the restless young people always found ways to have fun, and dark, rainy nights were perfect for ghost stories. Student Joke and her friends huddled in the back row, whispering like annoying chickens. They heard rumors about a strange student who had been appearing all over the school. She wandered everywhere and often showed up in group photos, but no one knew who she was. Conveniently, there was always one or two empty desks in each classroom, and those were said to be her designated seats. The sound of the rain mixed with the low murmurs, creating a creepy atmosphere that sent a chill down their spines all the way to their smelly butts. The rumor was absurd, but Joke couldn't help but glance over, secretly letting out a sigh of relief. The desk was empty, and nothing happened. Fear arrived quickly, but left just as fast, soon drowned out by laughter and chatter. However, the real test had yet to begin tonight. The rain was pouring down, showing no signs of letting up. Joke struggled to say goodbye to her friends under her umbrella, but they ignored her smelly bullshit, which left her feeling a bit frustrated. Recently, for some reason, her friends had been brushing her off, either intentionally or unintentionally. She didn't want to think too much about it. Standing at the corner, the alley before her was pitch black with no lights. The eerie part was, even though no one was around, every night, the alley echoed with the sound of footsteps, sometimes accompanied by strange singing. Joke sighed, reluctant but resigned. She had promised her mother to run an errand, so she had to go through this alley. Taking a deep breath, she tried to calm her racing heart and, with a burst of energy, she sprinted down the path. As she ran, a light appeared ahead, and Joke's heart lifted. It turned out there was a light shop at the end of the alley, which only opened at night. The surroundings were pitch dark, and she couldn't see a thing, but the shop shone brightly, the lights casting a dazzling array of reflections, the only source of light in the entire area. Joke pushed open the door, and a heavy weight lifted off her chest. Inside and outside, it was like two different worlds. Outside, the wind howled and the atmosphere was eerie, while inside, the shop was warm and bright. The lights flowed like a river suspended in the air, silently enveloping every customer. Gradually, Joke's nerves eased under the comforting glow. Then she heard a familiar voice, a man gently reminding her that running in the dark will make her trip. The handsome man named Juan was the owner of the light shop. Joke often came here to buy light bulbs for her mother, and over time they became familiar with each other. The man was patient and gentle with her, always ready with a jar of candy and a jar of his charming hormones. The colorful wrappers of the candies sparkled under the lights. Joke picked her favorite, yellow cream flavored. She smiled and said it was also her mother's favorite when she was young. One, ever thoughtful, unwrapped the candy for her. Joke always had something to say about it. She wasn't a child anymore, so why treat her like a giant baby? But One simply smiled and said she was still a child in his peeping eyes. He then pointed to the child's anti-lost necklace around her neck, and they shared a knowing smile, but not a kiss yet. This childish necklace was actually a gift from her father. Although he worked abroad and was far away, he always thought of her. Joke, in turn, wore the necklace to keep him close in spirit, even adding a longer chain to wear it all the time. The rain kept pouring outside, and the two continued to chat. Joke asked One why he wore sunglasses indoors. He explained that his peeping eyes had been damaged from working here for so long. Joke suggested he lower the brightness of the lights, but he laughed and refused. After all, this was a light shop, and it was open from midnight until dawn. Curious, Joke asked if there were still customers this late. One answered firmly that he had to stay here and wait for every customer. Joke marveled at his dedication, but One gently added that he was lucky to have a shop like this. The warm light melted away Joke's last bit of hesitation. After thinking it over, she quietly told One that something strange was going on in the alley. She thought she really saw a ghost earlier, but it was too dark to be sure. One was taken aback, his expression growing serious. Joke was a special child. She could see things that ordinary people couldn't. Feeling a bit frightened, Joke listened as One reassured her not to be scared. Instead of calling them ghosts, he suggested referring to them as strangers. These strangers often blended in with crowds, and only careful observation could distinguish them. He warned Joke to be cautious around them. If she accidentally encountered one, the best thing was to pretend she hadn't seen anything. If she already had, she should act like nothing was strange about them and slip by unnoticed. At this, Joke's heart jumped into her throat as another world slowly revealed itself before her eyes. In fact, she wasn't alone. In the hospital's intensive care unit, a nurse named Park was facing the same bizarre events. After working long hours, the nurses took turns resting, and it happened to be Park's turn to be on call. Suddenly, a man covered in dirt, disoriented, appeared in the ward, desperately searching for the morgue. Park didn't have time to ask questions before the alarm suddenly went off, pulling her back to her duties. By the time she finished settling the patients, the man had vanished without a trace. However, what Park didn't know was that the strange man was also one of Juan's customers that evening. Back at the shop, Juan apologized for telling Joke such frightening things. Before she left, he gave her a flashlight to help disperse the darkness. The flashlight looked old and even needed to be hand-cranked to generate power. Joke was thrilled, and after picking up the light bulbs her mother needed, she waved goodbye to Juan. For the young girl, so many things had happened that evening, she didn't notice the oddities right before her eyes. As they talked earlier, the brilliant light illuminated the glass, reflecting Juan's face. Strangely, the familiar figure with sunglasses was now an elderly man. The fog was thick, and the truth remained elusive. However, the strange events of the night were far from over. With the help of the flashlight, Joke made her way back to her apartment on the 8th floor. In the hallway, a woman was dragging a large suitcase, rushing by. Joke didn't think much of it, assuming it was a neighbor leaving for a trip. In fact, this woman, named Young, wasn't a resident of the building at all. She was an intruder. Dressed in white, with long hair flowing, Young sat by the bus stop every day, tapping her fingers on the bench, waiting for someone unknown. The heavy suitcase was her only possession. She waited in all kinds of weather, as if she were a statue, staring vacantly into the distance. Her strange behavior caught the attention of a businessman named Min. He was kind-hearted and thought she was in trouble, so he offered her his phone. But Young ignored him until that night, when the heavy rain poured down. Min offered her his umbrella, unable to bear seeing her standing there. This time, she responded, even asking if she could shelter from the rain at his place. Coincidentally, Min also lived on the 8th floor. After a moment's hesitation, he agreed, deciding to be a good Samaritan. When they got to his apartment, he called a taxi for her. However, the moment they entered the apartment, things started to unravel. Young refused to turn on the lights, soaking wet, letting water drip from her hair. In the boundless darkness, she stared intensely at Min, who couldn't help but feel a chill. Then, he was horrified to notice her fingers twisted unnaturally, with her nails completely reversed. The next moment, the door silently closed, and when she pushed it open again, her suitcase seemed heavier. Looking closely, Min saw blood slowly dripping from it. At that moment, Joke returned home. Oblivious to the scene, she simply greeted them politely. In the darkness of the night, they passed each other by. However, as Young looked at Joke's retreating figure, her expression grew complex. Meanwhile, the story in the alley continued. A new tenant named Yoon had moved in. She had a limited budget and didn't like noise, so she had to forego renting a better-equipped apartment and instead chose a dilapidated house. The realtor assured her that the surrounding area was quiet, with all the nearby apartments empty. Though the house was old and one of the doors wouldn't open, Yoon sighed and rented it anyway, thinking about her finances. She spent the next few days fixing things up, moving in piles of books, and making the place feel cozy. Meanwhile, Park had fallen into a deep, emotional slump. Working at the hospital was exhausting not only physically but also mentally, especially in the intensive care unit, a place like the gateway to the afterlife, filled with people teetering between life and death. A recent major car accident had flooded the ward with patients, forcing the nurses to work non-stop, tending to both patients and their desperate families. To those families, the hospital was a final lifeline. Yet all the medical staff could do was connect tubes and maintain vital signs. Whether the patients would wake up depended on their will to survive. But will to survive felt more like a hollow comfort than a real remedy, intangible, invisible, and far from a guaranteed cure. During these moments, Park would feel particularly helpless. Seeking a moment of peace, she locked herself in the bathroom. Yet even there, the family members wouldn't give up. They followed her, their sorrowful voices pressing through the thin door. One woman cried out in anguish, demanding to know what kind of willpower could bring her loved one back from the brink. But no one could give her an answer. Park understood that anguish all too well. She had once hovered at death's door herself. After an accident, she had fallen into a coma. The doctor had told her mother that the will to survive was crucial. But her mother didn't understand. All she could do was pray in desperation. Miraculously, Park had awakened. Yet even now, she had no idea how she recovered or where that willpower had come from. Perhaps all anyone could do was wait. Hearing this, the woman outside the door broke down completely, but something about her wailing felt off. An eerie, shrill cry that echoed like a ghostly scream, twisted into a single desperate threat, telling the doctors to find a way to save the patient. A chill ran through Park, and she began to tremble. Only then did she realize the presence outside the door wasn't human. Yet the voice soon faded, and silence returned, as if it had all been nothing more than a bizarre nightmare, blurring the line between reality and illusion. Lost in confusion, Park struggled to regain her composure. Meanwhile, life wasn't going any better for Yoon. She was frustrated to discover she'd been duped by a shady realtor. The promised absolute quiet was technically true. No one lived nearby. But every midnight, some clueless guy would belt out songs in the alley, keeping her awake. His name was Huck, and to be fair, he wasn't trying to disturb anyone. The alley was pitch black and eerily silent, yet it was the only way home. With no other choice, he'd sing to calm his nerves, sprinting through the alley as if fleeing for his life. On rainy nights, the slippery road made his hurried footsteps even noisier. After enduring it for days, Yoon finally snapped. She threw open the window and shouted at the boy. The sudden burst of light startled Huck so much that he let out a terrified scream, his heart nearly leaping from his chest as he scrambled away in a panic. Yoon could only sigh and let it go. The heavy rain showed no signs of stopping. After evening classes ended, Jok glanced at her deskmate, who was sound asleep like a pig and impossible to wake. She chuckled helplessly and decided to head home alone. Tonight, she needed to visit the light shop again to pick up something for her mom. Holding her umbrella and the flashlight one had given her, she carefully made her way through the dark alley. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead, tall and slender, with long, rain-soaked hair and bright red high heels clicking against the wet pavement. Oddly, the woman wasn't using an umbrella and looked utterly drenched. Feeling sorry for her, Jok hurried over, raising her umbrella and calling out if she wanted to share her umbrella. The woman slowly turned her head, revealing a pale face, and asked who she was. Jok explained she was just a student passing by, going to the light shop. But before she could finish, the woman's body twisted and contorted within seconds, transforming from an ordinary person into a horrifying creature. Terror clutched at Jok's heart, but she remembered Wan's warning. Fighting back her fear, she forced herself to act as though nothing had happened. Mumbling an excuse, she hurried past the creature, but the woman didn't let her go. Her body swayed unnaturally as she staggered after Jok, her footsteps echoing through the alley. Jok screamed in a chicken voice and ran fast like a Tesla bike. Fortunately, she spotted the familiar glow of warm light just ahead. One had heard the commotion and stepped outside, shielding Jok behind his muscles. His voice was calm and gentle as he reassured her, urging her to go home to her mother. Once Jok had left, One removed his sunglasses and fixed his gaze on the creature. After a moment of silent tension, the woman slowly backed away into the darkness. Meanwhile, strange occurrences continued to plague Yoon in her home. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was living there, someone she couldn't see. Flickering lights, doors that locked themselves, and fleeting shadows were all signs of the unseen presence that had quietly seeped into her life. Her body trembled as her defenses slowly crumbled. Yet she wasn't the only one to discover this unsettling secret. Huck had noticed it too. Time rewinds to that fateful night. The reason Huck fled in terror after Yoon's scolding was because he had seen someone else inside her home. Under the warm yellow light, a shadowy figure stood silently behind her, as though the two were fused together, inseparable. Yet Yoon remained completely unaware. The sight was so unsettling that Huck turned and bolted. After that, the alley's darkness seemed to grow even deeper. Fortunately, tonight he had a companion. It's Young, who was dragging a suitcase that left a faint trail of blood. Unaware of anything unusual, Huck was simply relieved to have someone walking beside him. As they strolled past Yoon's house, Huck couldn't resist mentioning the eerie incident from before. To his surprise, Young's eyes lit up with curiosity, and she even suggested knocking on the door to ask, though her question sent chills down Huck's spine. She wanted to know if the two people inside the house knew each other. Terrified, Huck grabbed her arm, urging her to leave, but Young only gave a cryptic smile and asked if he really thought he could leave this place. The moment her words fell, Huck's body began to twist unnaturally, his legs bending at impossible angles. Overwhelmed by fear, he lost all sense of reason and began running, screaming as he desperately tried to escape. Yet no matter how far he ran, he found himself trapped in a looping maze, always returning to the same alley. Meanwhile, inside the house, the lights flickered out. The unseen presence closed in, and Yoon's composure shattered. She frantically tried to escape, but no matter how hard she pulled, the door wouldn't budge. In the suffocating grip of terror, she let out a desperate wail, clinging to the faint hope of survival. At that moment, the door of the light shop swung open, and a man dressed in black stepped inside, a seasoned police officer. With years of experience, the officer had grown accustomed to walking the fine line between danger and justice. Yet his sharp eyes and unyielding persistence made him an outsider within the police force. While his colleagues focused on closing cases quickly, he was relentless, chasing down every loose thread, even if it led nowhere. Unlike most of his colleagues who prioritized high-profile cases, the officer believed that no case was too small, as long as it led to the truth. Although his arrest rate was impressive, his success rate in closing cases remained low, largely because he refused to settle for easy answers. Recently, he had latched onto yet another stubborn hunch. An elderly man living alone had been found dead at home. The hospital had confirmed it as a sudden heart attack, with solid evidence supporting natural causes, making it an open and shut case. Yet after visiting the scene, the officer spotted several inconsistencies. For one, the TV was playing a program on repeat, a feature the elderly man, who wasn't tech-savvy, wouldn't have known how to use. Furthermore, the man was right-handed, yet the TV remote had been placed on the left side. All signs pointed to one conclusion: someone had visited the house on the day of the old man's death. Perhaps the heart attack was just a cover for something far more sinister. Yet no one else seemed to care. With the man's wife long deceased and his children living abroad, the case was deemed unimportant. With stacks of case files piling up at the station, no one wanted to waste time on what appeared to be a simple death. But the officer couldn't let it go. His pursuit of the truth wasn't just a matter of duty, it was the only thing holding him together. Once upon a time, the officer had a happy family, a gentle wife who had been expecting their first child, but his obsession with work kept him away from home too often. By the time he realized what he had lost, it was too late. The home he had lovingly built was now nothing more than a cold, empty shell. Work became his entire world. The only thing that could ease the ache in his heart was the pursuit of justice. Fueled by this unwavering belief, the officer continued to follow the trail of clues. That's when he discovered a critical detail. The mark at the corner of the old man's mouth wasn't an age spot, but a smear of black bean sauce. Suddenly, a man named Kim became the prime suspect. A witness had reported seeing Kim near the house on the day of the incident. However, once the death was ruled natural, Kim was no longer under suspicion. Coincidentally, Kim owned a restaurant that served black bean noodles. With his target locked in, the officer quietly approached the restaurant, ready to uncover the truth. Faced with the relentless questioning, Kim remained remarkably composed, even finding time to criticize the officer for not using honorifics. The officer instantly knew he was dealing with a tough opponent. Without solid evidence and against someone with nerves of steel, this wouldn't be easy. But the stronger the opponent, the fiercer the officer's resolve. He had all the time in the world to see this through. Before leaving, the officer fixed Kim with a meaningful gaze and asked him if he was going to say "come again" next time when a guest was leaving. Kim narrowed his eyes, clearly underestimating the officer. Locking eyes with his opponent, he forced the words through gritted teeth, telling him to come again next time. And so, the game of cat and mouse began. The officer threw himself into the chase with tireless enthusiasm, showing up at every possible crime scene. The only thing that annoyed him was that, for some reason, his lighter had suddenly stopped working. It just wouldn't spark. But he soon brushed the trivial issue aside when a new opportunity presented itself. The roar of a motorcycle echoed through the narrow alley. Kim, fully geared up, was chasing down a frail young woman who stumbled ahead of him, terrified. At the critical moment, the officer leaped out of the shadows, tackling Kim to the ground. Pinning him down, he turned to the woman, asking with concern if her sexy body was hurt. Strangely, Kim's eyes widened in shock at those words. Even more unsettling, the woman slowly raised her head, her face streaked with diabetic blood. The officer's breath hitched. He recognized her instantly. She was the victim of an arson case he'd investigated. The case file was still sitting in his drawer. There was no mistake. She was supposed to be dead. Yet here she stood, very much alive. Stunned, the officer's mind reeled. Before he could react, a blinding light engulfed the alley as a massive truck thundered toward them. In that split second, he caught a glimpse of Kim's eyes. His pupils had narrowed into vertical slits just like a cat's, but there was no time to question it. The next moment, the light swallowed him whole. When the officer came to, both Kim and the woman had vanished without a trace. Steadying his breath, the officer strained to hear the distant hum of the Tesla motorcycle and resumed his pursuit through the maze-like alleys. The sound led him to the light shop, but then it abruptly stopped. He had lost the trail. Pushing open the shop's door, he asked the shopkeeper if he'd seen the suspect. Just then, Young arrived at the shop. The officer's sharp instincts kicked in as his gaze dropped to the faint bloodstains on the floor. He asked her if she was hurt, but she brushed off the question with a vague reply. The officer didn't press the issue. Instead, he quietly handed her a raincoat. The downpour outside showed no sign of letting up. Young slipped on the raincoat and stepped back into the rain-soaked alley, passing by Joke, who rushed past in a hurry. The young girl grumbled to herself, confused as to why her mother needed yet another light bulb. Still, she did as she was told, making her daily trip to the light shop. This time, however, One was busy chatting with the officer. With a gentle smile, he told Joke to go home now. Her mom's waiting for her. Blinking in confusion, Joke nodded and turned to leave. As the door swung shut behind her, the officer chuckled. He didn't expect so many customers this late. One, however, fixed the officer with an unreadable gaze, asking him what brought him here. The officer's instincts tingled. There was something odd about this shop, yet strangely enough, he didn't feel uneasy. In fact, he felt inexplicably drawn to the place. His eyes wandered across the walls adorned with lights of all shapes and sizes, their warm glow reflecting in his gaze. A complicated mix of emotions stirred within him. He replied softly that this was the only place still lit up at this hour. Meanwhile, at the hospital, a burial preparation ceremony was underway. Though the process was simple, it required meticulous care. The deceased was gently groomed, dressed in burial clothes, and placed in the mortuary. The body would remain there until the day of the funeral, when it would be laid to rest in a coffin. The assistant, still new to the job, couldn't hide her nervousness. When the sound of escaping air echoed through the room, she jumped, her face draining of color. The elderly doctor told her to show respect since the departed deserved their courtesy. With that, they resumed their work. The doctor carefully placed cotton in the deceased's mouth, lending the face a peaceful expression, as if the person had simply drifted into a serene sleep, ready to bid farewell to the world. Yet just as they finished, an eerie scene unfolded. The doctor stood beside the deceased, speaking softly as if in conversation. Though his tone was calm, the dead woman's face twisted in anguish. Her voice, thick with sorrow, trembled through the air, saying that she couldn't die like this. The doctor's gaze remained steady as he replied with gentle reassurance. He said, "It's natural to feel regret. Many find it hard to accept, and that unwillingness can lead to dangerous attachments. But she mustn't linger. Soon, this unfamiliar feeling will pass." His voice was like a lullaby. He told her she was going somewhere brighter, somewhere free from pain. Once she arrived, she would forget all her burdens. Yet the woman's eyes still darted with fear, demanding to know where she was going since she didn't even know the way. The doctor's gaze softened. He said wherever she went, it was still a world where people lived. So, there's nothing to fear. With that, he gently slid the body into the mortuary cabinet and offered a final bow of respect. From within the cold metal confines, faint sobs echoed, soft yet heavy with sorrow. But no matter how deep the longing, the boundary between life and death could never be crossed. There are more stories in the hospital at midnight. Another night shift, Park gathered her energy and pressed the button for the 8th floor to head to the intensive care unit. She noticed a disoriented man in the corner of the elevator. He was drenched and looked pitiful and helpless. He urgently asked Park if the patients in the ICU could wake up. The same question again. Park could only give the honest answer that the hospital couldn't guarantee anything. It all depended on the patient's will. To her surprise, after hearing this, the man was devastated, crying out loud in grief. In the next moment, torrents of water flooded in, submerging the elevator. Park screamed, but the man remained oblivious, crying even harder. Fortunately, with a ding, the elevator reached its floor, and the water vanished in an instant. It felt like a dream once again. Park fell to the ground, gasping for air, her heart racing wildly, beating out of rhythm. She knew better than anyone that this wasn't a dream. The pain, despair, and regret were far too real. Meanwhile, the conversation at the light shop was still going on. The officer stubbornly repeated that the suspect was in his 30s, 1.8 meters tall, short hair, average appearance, riding a motorcycle with cat-like eyes. However, One shook his head, saying he'd never seen him. The officer felt disappointed but decided to head out and search again. However, One stopped him, saying it was raining outside and this was the only shop still open. He suggested the officer wait a little longer. Strangely, the officer stayed. At the same time, there was a rare good development in the ICU. A patient with alcohol poisoning had woken up and could be transferred to a regular ward. On the way to the new room, the patient was still dazed. To comfort him, Park shared her own experience. She told him it was normal. Many Many people who had been through major accidents suffered from delusions after waking up. They lost their memory, couldn't think clearly, had trouble distinguishing between space and people, and saw hallucinations. In other words, those who had been near death seemed to see another world. But with external intervention, these delusions could be cured. Once cured, those vague and strange memories would naturally disappear. Comforted by Park's words, the patient gradually calmed down. However, in truth, Park's delusions had not been cured, or perhaps she had chosen not to be cured, keeping this ability intact. This was why Park could hear the questions in the restroom, feel the suffocating water in the elevator, and see patients lingering on the edge of life and death. The man who had asked about the morgue was one of them. In fact, he was also a patient in the ICU. He had been buried alive due to owing money to loan sharks, which explained why he was covered in dirt. Now, with his life hanging by a thread, he instinctively sought peace in the afterlife, giving up hope for life, unwilling to burden his family. Still, Park wanted to help him. She put headphones on him and played music, hoping to instill some willpower and get him to open his eyes again. After narrowly escaping death, Park had gradually adapted to coexisting with the strange. However, Joke couldn't do the same. Unable to buy the light bulb, Joke left the shop and ran home, as the dark night always filled her with fear. Yet on the way, she encountered another strange man. The man, covered in ice and snow, was shivering uncontrollably and angrily searching for a smelly dog. According to him, the dog had been barking at him all night, preventing him from getting a good night's sleep. So he had come out to confront the animal and end it once and for all. But despite hearing the barking, he still couldn't find the dog, which only made him more frustrated. When Joke heard this, her face went pale. She was standing right in front of him but couldn't hear any barking. She suddenly remembered the man's warning and quickly made an excuse to leave. When she got home, still shaken, she went to seek comfort from her mother, only to find her acting strangely. Her mother wasn't speaking, didn't turn on the lights, and simply sat quietly on the couch, lost in thought. Joke felt a bit aggrieved. She tried to coax her mother, promising to buy the light bulb the next day and asking her not to sulk. Then, as she nestled into her mother's embrace, Joke was surprised by the faint floral scent coming from her. The fragrance made her feel especially at ease. In the pitch-black room, the mother and daughter embraced each other, unaware that they were being watched. Outside, Young, dragging a suitcase, was staring at them through the peephole. Like a nervous wreck, she asked the same question again. She desperately wanted to know if the two people inside could recognize each other. It was clear that the answer was yes. Obsession tangled, and the secrets of this world were slowly being revealed, all beginning with a rainy day. Strangers, seemingly unrelated, found their fates intertwined in this rain. The man crying in the elevator was a bus driver. For him, that day had started like any other. After finishing his last shift, he planned to head home and rest. However, just before setting off, the bus driver noticed a problem with the brakes. He called the company to ask if he should fix it on the spot. The company told him that if he didn't return the bus to the garage for repairs, he would have to pay for it out of his own pocket. The bus driver grumbled a bit, inspected the issue more carefully, and confirmed it was a minor problem with little impact. Since he was only driving one more trip, he decided to go ahead and finish his shift. After all, every little bit saved counted. The bus started moving slowly, and the passengers began boarding in the pouring rain. The first to board was a young boy who was sent off by his grandmother with a cheerful goodbye. The second passenger was Min. He had just gotten off the subway looking a little flustered, but in a great mood. The reason for his joy was the ring he held close to his chest. Tonight, Min planned to propose, and his girlfriend, Young, was the one he wanted to marry. They had been in a relationship for years, transitioning from their young, naive days on campus to a more mature bond, and their love for each other was strong. However, Min's mother had never approved of the relationship, primarily because Young was deaf. To his mother, Young was unworthy of her son. She even went as far as to approach Young, urging her to break up with him. Min had no idea about any of this. Young, feeling insecure, had planned to quietly leave, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon the love of her life and agreed to meet him. While Young was filled with uncertainty about their future, Min, full of hope and excitement, smiled foolishly as he repeatedly stroked the ring, imagining a life with his beloved. They would soon know the outcome of their love when the bus reached its destination. The third passenger to board was Huck, the teenager who loved basketball. He had just skipped class to play a few games with his friends. Huck had bought a new pair of shoes and was very careful with them, preferring to run slower rather than risk dirtying them, which earned him some teasing from his friends. As he boarded the bus, the tires rolled over a puddle, splashing water onto his shoes, which left him a little annoyed. The teenager didn't quite understand what it meant to truly worry. For now, his biggest concern concern was probably just those dirty basketball shoes. Next, the bus welcomed its fourth and fifth passengers. One was Yoon, the woman trapped in the house, and the other was Hui, the strange woman in red high heels who had been chasing Joke in the alley. They were a couple, though their love was not accepted by society. Hui was the other person in the house. Despite the deep love they shared, they were rejected by the world around them. Besides gender, age was another issue. Yoon was still young and sexy, while Hui had already grown older. When they stood side by side, people often mistook them for mother and daughter. The reason Yoon was searching for a quiet place to live was actually Hui's insistence. She despised crowds and didn't want her younger lover to suffer from public gossip. In truth, Yoon didn't care. She was brave and passionate, never thinking love was a mistake, and she had no interest in hiding it. But Hui had many concerns. Deep down, she feared that Yoon's future might be ruined because of her. Hui's evasive attitude deeply hurt Yoon, and the fundamental rift between them seemed impossible to reconcile. The two had an argument in the heavy rain. Afterward, Yoon boarded the bus, and despite her guilt and helplessness, Hui followed her. Sitting in the back row, Hui gently patted Yoon's shoulder, trying to comfort her, but Yoon, still angry, ignored her attempt at reconciliation. In this tense atmosphere, the final two passengers boarded the bus. They are Joke and her mother. Joke's house was under reconstruction, so during this transitional period, she had to endure a little inconvenience, taking the bus to cross the bridge to school. Her mother was very worried about her, but Joke didn't mind the inconvenience. Since her mother worried about her safety, she always picked her up after school. Seeing Joke gloating, her mother couldn't help but laugh. She told her daughter that even after they moved, she would still pick her up. Joke jumped up in excitement, the only regret being that her father was away on a business trip. But she cheerfully thought there would be plenty of opportunities in the future. So after evening classes, mother and daughter chatted as they walked and boarded the bus. A naive child, a basketball-loving teenager, a man preparing for a proposal, a couple having a quarrel, and a mother and daughter cuddling up. This was just an ordinary bus carrying different strangers to their destinations, but fate had other plans. In the next moment, disaster struck. While crossing the bridge, the bus suddenly malfunctioned. The brakes failed, and with the slick, rainy roads, it crashed into another vehicle, broke through the guardrail, and plummeted straight down into the water. It became a tragic accident, and Young, who had been leaving to pick up her boyfriend, witnessed it all. Devastated, she desperately tried to call for help, but couldn't make a sound, missing the crucial opportunity to summon help in time. Moments later, the sound of sirens and flashing lights filled the air, and the news exploded. After much effort, the injured were rushed to the hospital, and their fates diverged. The bus driver was the most severely injured. He had swallowed a lot of water and was declared dead not long after arriving at the hospital. Two others who passed away were Joke's mother and Hui. In the most critical moments, they had both instinctively protected their loved ones, giving Joke and Yoon a chance at life. Hui had held onto Yoon's waist tightly, using her back to shield her from the impact. When they were brought to the hospital, their bodies were so entwined that they couldn't be separated like conjoined twins. Min and Hook were severely injured, one with a broken back, the other with twisted feet. Only the little boy suffered the least. In the face of death, Huck had given everything to hang on to the basketball, which offered the boy some support. The accident was horrific. 3 people dead, 4 in a coma, clinging to life in the ICU. Upon hearing the news, their families were devastated and uncontrollably emotional. When Min's mother saw his phone, she lashed out at Young, blaming her for causing his death. Little did she know, Young had chosen to end her own life, and in the confusion she couldn't discern what was real or not, only wishing to join Min. But tragically, when Min's parents calmed down and sent the latest news that their son was still alive, it was too late. Young struggled desperately, but it was in vain. In her final moments, she tried to scrape the rope off her wrists with her nails, which is why her hands looked so strange. In an ironic twist, while Young passed first, Min still had a faint hope. Many people who've had near-death experiences claim to see dark passages, bright lights, and their loved ones waiting. The dim alley, the light shop at the end, marked the beginning of another game, a game called Life and Death. The distance between life and death isn't as far as we think. Sometimes it's just a fine line. For the deceased, death is not an end, but a new beginning. According to tradition, the local people observe a 3-day funeral, which refers to the practice of waiting 3 days after a person passes before burial. During these 3 days, the living and the deceased get to say their goodbyes. In other words, the departed have 3 days to resolve any lingering regrets. After Young's death, her body was sent to the hospital and placed in a cabinet. On her left was Jok's mother, and on her right was Yoon's lover, Hui. Each of the 3 departed had unfinished business, all revolving around their loved ones, but their loved ones were lost and confused. Jok couldn't understand why her mother didn't speak, nor where the sweet fragrance around her came from. In reality, the spirit conversing with the old doctor as shown earlier was Jok's mother. She couldn't speak because her mouth was stuffed with cotton, and the fragrance came from the flowers in her coffin. Jok had no idea that her mother had passed away. She only sensed the strangeness of the world, but couldn't explain why. What puzzled her even more was why her mother insisted on forcing her to buy light bulbs from the light shop every day. After Jok brought them home, her mother would become irritable, dissatisfied no matter what. At school, no one paid attention to her, and she felt completely ignored without a single friend. On her way home, she would always encounter strange people. All the accumulated frustration weighed heavily on her, and one day, she couldn't take it anymore. She locked herself in her room, crying uncontrollably. Her mother, frantic with worry, insisted that Jok had to go buy the light bulbs, despite her protests. But Jok was determined to resist. As her mother gazed at her, deep concern appeared in her eyes. Inside the shop, the conversation between the shopkeeper Won and the officer was still ongoing. Following Won's suggestion, the officer decided to stay inside the shop to wait out the rain. As they chatted, the officer began to reminisce about the unborn child, a dull pain filling his chest. They had already bought shoes, knitted a hat, and even chosen a name. But at 4 months, his wife miscarried. The pain and guilt had tortured him ever since, and he couldn't forgive himself. Watching this strong man drown in his grief, one felt a pang of sympathy, as if he could truly empathize. Eventually, the rain lightened, and the officer turned and left. Meanwhile, in the house, Yoon was finally receiving a breakthrough. Staring at the flickering light bulb, flashes of familiar images rushed through her mind. The sleeping memories awakened, and a name rose from the depths of her heart. She remembered. In that instant, all the fear melted away, and love swelled inside her like a tidal wave, gently wrapping around her. The other person in the room wasn't some terrifying ghost, but her beloved. Together, they had crossed the river of life and death, always standing by each other. Yoon's eyes welled up, and she couldn't help but call out where her lover was. At that moment, Young's questions were all answered. Jok and her mother had never forgotten each other. After a brief moment of confusion, Yoon and Hui also recalled everything. 3 pairs of deep love, but Min, even now, still couldn't recognize Young. Just thinking about it made Young's heart sink like it had fallen into an ice pit. She had no idea where things had gone wrong, but more importantly, time was running out. Once the 3-day period ended, she would be powerless. Young made up her mind. Before the deadline came, no matter the cost, she had to finish what she had started. Meanwhile, a special guest appeared at the hospital. The boy who survived the bus accident was waiting outside. He handed Huck's basketball to Park and asked her to return it to his brother. Park's heart softened and she smiled, agreeing to do so. She placed the basketball under Huck's bed and silently prayed that this token would help lift the boy's spirits. The alley remained pitch black as Young brushed past the bus driver, both of them moving swiftly, as if searching for something. Soon after, the officer passed through as well. Standing at the fork in the road, he instinctively reached for his lighter. To his surprise, it sparked. In the flickering light, memories resurfaced. The sharp sound of a truck's horn seemed to echo in his ears, and an incredible guess formed in his mind. The officer didn't hesitate for a second. He ran toward the light shop. One was not surprised by his return. At the officer's request, one made him a cup of coffee. The officer took the cup and drank it hastily. His suspicions were confirmed. Although the coffee had just been brewed, it wasn't hot, and he couldn't taste a thing. The officer realized something was wrong with his body. Earlier, when the lighter lit up, he had seen his reflection on the wall. The back of his head was severely injured. At the same time, he realized he had been wandering in the alley, and all these strange happenings indicated that this place wasn't his world. Hearing this, one smiled faintly and couldn't help but admire the officer's sharpness. The officer truly lived up to his profession as a detective. In such situations, most people would remain oblivious. One was curious how the officer had figured it out. The officer explained that it was the lighter that had triggered his memory. It had been a moving-in gift from his wife. She had joked that they had only been saving money for a house, so the officer never had anything nice for himself. This lighter was a token, a thoughtful gift she insisted he keep. From then on, the officer carried it everywhere, and now it was the strength of his beloved that had awakened him. With a meaningful look, One then told the officer that the nights here would never end. The officer urgently asked where this place was. This question stirred mixed emotions in One, a ripple of feeling stirring within him. Looking at the officer, it was as though he saw his younger self. One replied that he asked the same question many years ago. Before answering the question, One shared his story. Despite still having the appearance of a middle-aged man, his soul had long grown old. Years ago, he had survived an earthquake, and he, along with his young daughter, had been trapped under the rubble. His daughter's leg was crushed by debris, and she was on the verge of death. One encouraged her with candy while searching desperately for a way out. As he searched, he wandered into a dark alley and after turning around in circles, was drawn to the only source of light, the light shop. At that time, its shopkeeper was a sexy woman. She also wore sunglasses, and beneath them, her eyes resembled those of a cat. One was desperate, crying and begging her to save his daughter. However, the woman stood firm. She told him that the little girl had to find the light shop herself, take her own light bulb, and only then would she be saved. One sank deeper into despair, knowing his daughter was trapped under the rubble and couldn't possibly get here. In his desperation, he begged the woman, offering to pay any price just to take his daughter's light bulb. Hearing this, the woman smiled playfully and reminded him that the price would cost him much of his time. Despite this, One agreed without hesitation. They made a deal. The woman handed him a light bulb and made an exception, allowing him to return it to his daughter, while One stayed behind and became the new owner of the light shop. With that, the secret was revealed. It turned out that this dark world was the afterlife. Those who had died prematurely, unable to live a full life due to accidents, continued their existence here. But this place didn't just hold the dead. It also contained those who were not yet dead, hanging by a thread. They teetered between life and death, still clinging to life. In the world of the living, the dead were seen as outcasts called ghosts. Here, however, the living were the outsiders, like wandering spirits. This is why Joke was ignored at school. She didn't truly belong to this world yet. There were two possible outcomes for the living who arrived here. Either they became residents or they became passers-by, corresponding to death and rebirth. The key to determining the outcome lay in the light shop. Every lit light bulb in the shop symbolized life. According to the rules, those near death had to navigate the alley, find the light shop at its end, and take their light bulb in order to return to the living world. The rules seemed simple, but they were far from easy. Most people who entered this world were confused and aimless, unable to find their purpose, endlessly wandering the alley. The hospital's reference to the patient's willpower was about seeing whether they could cut through the fog and enter the shop, reigniting the light of life in the lit bulbs. Those with strong willpower could overcome death with just a few hints, but besides relying on themselves, the rules also allowed for others' help. Whether it was a living person's call or a dead person's guidance, as long as the light bulb was found, it counted. At this point, it became clear that Young, Hui, and Joke's mother were actually the same kind of person, all aiming for the same goal. They were all deceased, hoping to guide their loved ones to the light shop within the final 3 days to retrieve their light bulb. In other words, they wanted their loved ones to survive. As the rules were revealed, the truth slowly came to light. The scene shifts to the man covered in ice and snow. On the day of the accident, another tragedy had occurred, and the man had been the victim. Lost in the mountains during a downpour, he had fallen off a cliff and succumbed to hypothermia. Luckily, a brave rescue dog had found him. The dog barked loudly while waiting for help, using its body to keep him warm. Eventually, the man lost consciousness, but at least he survived, though the dog tragically sacrificed its life. However, even in the afterlife, the dog had not forgotten its mission. It continued to bark and chase, determined to guide the man to the light shop. In the critical moment, the man finally understood this. Looking at the persistent dog, tears filled his eyes as he remembered everything. With the dog's help, he finally entered the shop and took the light bulb. At the same time, Yoon understood Hui's true intention. She regained her memories and was finally able to embrace her beloved once more. The two of them curled up on the hormone-smelling bed, enjoying the rare peace, love silently flowing between them. Hui knew her time was running out, so she softly asked her young lover if she didn't think the house felt too dark and if she wanted to go outside to the shop and find a light bulb. Yoon, nestled in her embrace, mumbled that she couldn't go out. However, Hui firmly told her that the door was open. She could leave anytime time. What had trapped Yoon wasn't the door, but the fear and obsession within her heart. As they held each other, Hui's voice echoed in her mind, begging her to live without her. After a brief silence, Yoon softly whispered she would. She promised Hui she would go to the light shop at the end of the alley. On the other side, Jok's mother was in distress. Although she had urged Joke to go buy the light bulb earlier, it wasn't Joke's true will, so it had been useless. The door was locked tight, and Joke wept quietly, her emotions completely shattered. She refused to step outside again. Her time was running out too. With no other choice, she decided to go out herself, taking slow, unsteady steps toward the light shop. Inside the shop, One and the officer were about to part ways. The officer had suspicion ingrained deep in his bones, and he still had doubts. One reminded him to pay attention while investigating the school, and if he had noticed that the children's names were often repeated because these were the names of children who had died young, and they were common fetal names in Korea. The officer froze. One continued saying, "This is also a world where people live. The children who didn't make it are somewhere here living their lives." His few words hit the officer's softest spot, and tears welled up in his eyes. He believed it all, yet the officer still had questions. He asked One why he hadn't told him this from the start. One replied because he knew he could go back. Once he realizes, he'll remember this world. It will blur the line between space and time, and this is what the doctors call delusion. Before leaving, the officer suddenly thought of Kim, the crime suspect. He realized that he had followed the sound of a Tesla motorcycle to the light shop, meaning Kim had been secretly helping him. He had so many questions about this man. One smiled and told him to go back and confirm it with Kim since he had figured it out. The next moment, a blinding light flashed. It was the light in the hospital room. Amid the cheers of everyone around him, the officer regained consciousness, and a tear slipped down his cheek. After sending the officer off, the shop welcomed its next customer. It's Huck, who was brought here by the bus driver. After the accident, the bus driver had felt immense guilt, believing he was responsible for the deaths of passengers, which was why he had cried uncontrollably in the hospital elevator as shown earlier. Upon arriving here, he decided to atone for his actions and do everything he could to send the living passengers back. The bus driver wandered around the alley, following the guidance of a basketball, and eventually found the weary Huck. This basketball had been brought to him by the rescued boy. Huck had been injured in the accident, his legs severely hurt, making movement difficult. Without hesitation, the bus driver picked him up and carried him straight to the shop. Huck was confused, but felt the kindness behind it. When they were near the shop, the bus driver set him down and said it's up to his will from now on. Huck was lost, having passed this place countless times without ever thinking of walking in. The bus driver patiently told him he must go in and then find his light. Only then can he leave this alley. Before parting, the bus driver looked at Huck's innocent face, and his eyes welled up. He choked on the apologizing words from his heart. Huck didn't understand, but under the bus driver's insistence, he obediently walked toward the light shop. Miraculously, once inside, he was immediately drawn to it. One looked at him and asked what he was looking for. Huck mentioned light. One smiled and meaningfully said they should not meet again. This was both a farewell and a blessing. The gentle light lit up, and another life was pulled back into the world of the living. The efforts of the dead were being rewarded one by one. However, Young was still making no progress. Since coming to this world, she had been searching for her lover Min, but Min didn't recognize her at all. Young realized that if she relied only on Min, she would never reach the light shop. The accident had left him broken in half, and after every few steps, he collapsed like a deflated balloon. So, Young kept finding him, packing him into a suitcase and sewing up his broken body. She had once been a craftswoman, and mending things was her specialty. At first glance, the terrifying scenes hide a deep love, but also an unspeakable resentment. Young couldn't understand why Min couldn't recognize her. She wondered if all their past love was just a lie. Yet no matter what, she still wanted her lover to live. With just 3 days left, Young decided to take a desperate chance. She forced herself to stop a bus, rushed on, and pulled open Min's shirt, revealing rows of stitches and exposing the truth. However, Min still couldn't remember her. He was overcome with pain, crying uncontrollably like a giant baby. Young had no more time. Using Min's guilt, she rushed to the light shop and reminded him to act natural when approaching the glowing light bulb, as if he had come on his own will. Young had prepared everything for him. In the chaos and confusion, Min embarked on this path to life. Meanwhile, the bus driver found Yoon and Hui's home. Seeing Hui, his tears welled up again and he couldn't help but apologize. Hui forgave him, understanding that the accident wasn't entirely his fault. Besides the brakes, the poorly maintained road and the torrential rain were also factors in the tragedy. She told the bus driver that humans can't escape accidents. Sometimes they're unlucky, sometimes others are unlucky, but they can't carry the weight of all misfortunes on their shoulders. It's everyone's misfortune. These heartfelt words brought the bus driver redemption. Hui then told the bus driver that Joke was still alive. When they first met in the alley, Hui had asked for Joke's address, just in case. She hadn't meant to frighten Joke, and the frightening chase was simply to guide her to the light shop. Following Hui's lead, the bus driver set out to find Joke. At the same time, after a long journey, Joke's mother finally reached the shop. Holding Joke's necklace, she knelt and sobbed, pleading with One to help her find her daughter's light bulb. One refused, and her arms flailed in silent sorrow. She couldn't bring Joke here. Just then, a strange sense of familiarity surged in Juan's chest, showing that he too had once been a desperate father. The hidden threads came together as the yellow candy wrapper, shining with tiny lights, awakened their memories. Juan suddenly realized the woman before him was actually his daughter, Joke's mother. Then, the woman recognized her father as well, and tears flooded down her face. They embraced and cried. The once tender child buried under rubble had grown to become a mother. No matter how aged she looked, to her father One, she would always be his young daughter. No wonder when One first met Joke, he felt an inexplicable closeness. It turned out that Joke was One's granddaughter. They were connected by blood. Just then, the bus driver found Joke and helped her understand everything. Her mother then returned home with the light bulb. Although hope for life had been found, Joke broke down in tears. She didn't want to leave, wanting to stay with her mother. But her mother told her there were people waiting for her in this world. Her father was waiting in despair for her to come home. With tears and a final embrace, Joke said her goodbyes. Because of that, the light bulb that belonged to her finally lit up. Yoon and Hui also reached their conclusion. Hui sent Yoon to the door. Yoon put on the red high heels and stepped outside. She made her way to the light shop and easily found the light bulb. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Yoon slowly regained consciousness. But then, with a slight smile, she smashed the light bulb without hesitation. The machine screamed as her life came to an abrupt end. It turned out that Yoon had already come to a decision. Rather than living on alone, she preferred a world where she could live with her lover. Here, they no longer had to hide. They could love boldly. This seems like a better world for both of them. Thus, the patients in the intensive care unit had made their choices, whether to stay or leave. Though the worlds were different, they were still living. Time passed, and it was soon time for Huck to be discharged. He had received treatment for his delusions and was gradually recovering. He told Park that he occasionally dreamed of wandering somewhere, waking up drenched in sweat. But mysteriously, he felt an overwhelming warmth in his heart. Park smiled but didn't speak. Huck cheerfully said he would see her next time. Park teased that they should not meet again. Huck was taken aback, feeling an odd sense of familiarity. Park winked and mentioned that old man who might seem awkward, but was actually quite warm. One day, Huck would forget the light shop, but that warmth would remain in his heart. Some would forget, and some would choose to remember. Afterward, Joke had just recovered from a serious illness and returned to her father's side. As winter set in, she gazed at the sky with a gentle smile. Joke refused treatment for her delusions. She wanted to remember her mother, to remember the light shop. In that world, her mother had also reunited with her father. The search dog stayed behind in the shop. Joke's mother opened the door and could see One, who was smiling as he peeled candy for his daughter. She muttered that she was just a kid. One nodded. In his eyes, she would always be a child. In the small light shop, there was a soft warmth in the air. 2 people and a dog curled up in the darkness of each night. There was no daylight, but there was light. Another person who chose to remember was the officer. He knew he had an unfinished appointment. A complaint had been made about a ghost haunting a fried noodles shop, and the officer couldn't help but laugh. He called out the name respectfully in the shop, and Kim arrogantly appeared. He then explained everything. It turned out that Kim was actually a law enforcer in this world, disguised as the owner of the noodle shop. When the dead hold grudges and can't rest, they become ghosts, wandering in a world they don't belong to. For example, the woman who had died unjustly in an arson case. It was Kim's job to catch these ghosts and send them back to another world. His meeting with the officer was just an accident. Kim knew that the officer's time was near, but he had been living alone, unable to move around, and hadn't eaten a proper meal in ages. He couldn't bear to leave him, so he stepped in and brought him a bowl of noodles, quietly accompanying him to the end of his journey. Unexpectedly, this stubborn officer caught him red-handed. He had been tailing him, mistaking him for a serial killer. During the struggle, an out-of-control truck came barreling toward them. In a life or death moment, Kim shielded the officer, sacrificing himself to save him. Though he lost his life, Kim was very philosophical. He understood the truth about life and death. It was just a change of place. The two men who had fought so fiercely now respected each other. Kim admired the officer, believing he had potential. His eyes were special. He could see ghosts. So Kim took off his sunglasses and smiled, asking if the officer wanted to take his position. The future would involve handling many troublesome cases. The officer smiled back, knowing that solving unresolved cases was his specialty. Thus, a new law enforcer was born. Everyone's life slowly returned to normal except for Min, who still lived in torment. His mind was confused, often mistaking day for night. His body was in disarray, and he had lost parts of his memory. People kept telling him that he had a beloved girlfriend named Young, who had died because of him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember anything. To him, Young was a completely unfamiliar name. The doctor advised him to reduce stimuli and let go of the things he should forget to start a new life. So Min returned to the bridge where the accident had happened and stared at the rushing river, heartlessly throwing his phone into the water. However, this was not the end. Min's forgetfulness became Young's obsession. The resentment in her heart grew, tangled with her longing, and this unbalanced emotion gradually turned into a disaster. When she attempted suicide, she said she wanted to go to the place where Min was. Now, this wasn't a lover's whisper, but a curse filled with resentment. In a place Min couldn't see, a pale ghost was wrapping itself around him. At the same time, Joke saw a ghost at school, and it was the key figure in a missing person case. The officer received a new report and went to a building where something had happened. Outside the building, he met a strange and flamboyant man. The man spoke cryptically, saying that the passage of time had nothing to do with the dead. The conversation abruptly ended, but the story of the light shop would continue. The boundary between life and death cannot be crossed, but as long as we remember wherever we are, it is a place for people to live, and in time, the answer will be found. The future holds countless unresolved cases waiting ahead. The greatest regret in life is often not loss, but the failure to say a proper goodbye. In the world of the living, time always moves forward, while in the world of the dead, it is a night that never ends. This time, displacement is the harsh truth of life and death parting. We always think death is the end, but for the living, it's just the beginning of another journey. Some choose to forget to heal, while others insist on remembering to mourn. Everyone is searching for their own way to reconcile, and behind these choices is our contemplation of life. But just like the light that always shines in the light shop, all regrets may eventually turn into light that illuminates each other. Every story will come to its own conclusion, and we will always reconcile with the deepest regrets in our lives. So there's no need to fear and no need to force it. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.